Okay, let's lock in. This video is gonna be packed with a lot of details, but once you're breaking down for what it actually is, you realize that it's so much more easy than it looks. So this whole topic is just talking about how oxygen gets from the air into your working muscles, and then how carbon dioxide gets taken away so that you can produce energy for a long period of time during exercise. So by the end of this video, you want to understand how to explain the structures in the respiratory system and what each of them do, explain breathing mechanics using pressure gradients and Boyle's law, explain gaseous exchange using partial pressure and diffusion, define every lung volume and lung capacity, describe the heart structure, blood and blood vessels, explain the cardiac cycle, circulation, venous return and vascular shunting, calculate and interpret heart rate measures, stroke volume, cardiac output, explain what we mean by bradycardia in trained athletes, explain the different acute responses to warm up and exercise, and be able to link unhealthy lifestyle choices to the damage they cause and how they can reduce performance. So let's start with definitions. What do we mean by respiratory system and cardiovascular system? The respiratory system brings air into the body and removes air out of the body. So specifically, we're bringing oxygen into the body to provide the oxygen to the blood, and we're removing carbon dioxide from the blood. The cardiovascular system is made up of a pump and pipes. The heart being the pump because it pumps blood around the body, and the blood vessels carry the blood towards the heart and away from the heart. So, how do both of these systems work together? We're going to break it down into 5 simple steps. Step number 1, ventilation. This is simply where air moves into the lungs and air moves out of the lungs. So, air moving into the lungs, we call that inspiration. Inspiration. And air moving out of the lung, we call that expiration. And air moves all the way down into these different pipes, which we're going to look at later on in this video, and down to this fluffy structure down here, which we call the alveoli. Alveoli is plural, means many of them, and alveolus is singular, which means just one of these is called an alveolus. So we're going to look at that in detail in the video, but on to the next step, we have something called gaseous exchange. So when you breathe in, the oxygen from the air that you breathe in diffuses into the blood from the alveoli, and carbon dioxide diffuses from the blood into the alveoli and then gets sent out of the body, and you exhale the carbon dioxide. Step 3, transportation. Blood carries oxygen via hemoglobin. So hemoglobin is a protein which is very important for carrying oxygen in the blood, and the oxygen is being carried towards the tissues and the working muscles in the body. Next, we have delivery and use. So the oxygen gets to the muscle and it gets transported into the muscle cells, and the oxygen is now used to make something we call ATP to be able to release energy. So ATP is a molecule which is a very important molecule for releasing energy in the muscles so that you can exercise. And the last step is the removal of CO2. So bringing oxygen in is one thing, but we want to remove the waste, and CO2 is waste. So it's just the reverse. CO2 gets moved out into the blood and then back to the lungs, and then you exhale, and that's CO2 gone from the body. And this carries on over and over and over again. Each time you breathe, this is what's going on. Now let's break down the structure and function of the respiratory system. So we have our nice little diagram here. We're going to label it with each of the structures you need to know. So firstly, we've got the pharynx, which is in your throat region, and the pharynx produces a shared pathway for air and also for food that is moving down from the nose or that mouth area. Next, we have something called the larynx. The larynx is often called the voice box. The larynx connects the pharynx to the trachea, and it helps to protect the airway so that food doesn't go down into your lungs. So this is the pharynx right here, made up of a bunch of little structures. And now we go down to the trachea. This is the trachea, which is your windpipe. The trachea. And it's a strong airway that carries air down towards the lungs. The trachea is designed to always stay open. Next, we have the bronchus. So bronchus is one of these pipes that branch out from the trachea. Bronchi is plural, so bronchi is both of them. Bronchi. So the trachea splits into the right bronchi, the right bronchus, and the left bronchus, and each bronchus takes air into each lung. So we go even smaller into the bronchioles. The bronchioles are the next small pipe. Bronchioles are these small pipes that are scattered in the lungs, and these are just smaller branches of the bronchi, and they help to control the airflow distribution through the lungs. And then we have alveoli. Alveoli are these very tiny air sacs at the very end of the bronchioles. So you can see it zoomed out here. Alveoli, these air sacs that are basically the main gas exchange surface in the lungs. And to do this, they have huge surface area, thin walls, and a closed capillary network, which create perfect conditions for diffusion. So that's really important. You remember those characteristics: huge surface area, thin walls, and a closed capillary network, which is perfect for diffusion. And there's also a large structure here, just below the lungs, a dome-shaped structure, which we call the diaphragm. The diaphragm. Okay, now let's look at ventilation mechanics. Ventilation mechanics is all about what happens at inspiration, so that's breathing in. What happens at expiration, so that's breathing out. We're going to talk about pressure gradients and why they're so important. We're going to talk about key concepts such as partial pressure, and we're going to talk about diffusion. And ventilation is driven by pressure gradients. Pressure gradients, which means that air moves from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. So this is where it gets interesting, because this means that the body has to get really smart. So from air to move from inside your body to outside, then that means the pressure inside the body has to be higher than the pressure outside, and that's how you can breathe out. But for air to move from outside the body to inside, that means the body has to be clever enough to find a way to make it so that the pressure outside of the body is higher than the pressure inside of the body. And we're going to look at how that happens. So it's important to understand something called Boyle's law. And Boyle's law states that if volume increases, pressure decreases, and vice versa. This is all assuming that temperature remains the same. So temperature is constant. So the key thing here is that if volume increases, pressure decreases, and the other way around as well. If volume decreases, pressure increases. All right, let's see how this works in practice. So during breathing in or inspiration at rest, which is an active process meaning it requires muscle contraction. So during inspiration, there are 6 things that happen. And if you ever get a question about the mechanics of inspiration and you answer with with these 6 steps, you're always going to get full marks. So the first thing that happens is the diaphragm contracts and flattens, causing it to move down. Then the external intercostals contract, and this lifts the rib cage up and out. Because of this, thoracic cavity volume increases and lung volume increases. Therefore, the pressure inside the lungs drops below atmospheric pressure, and air can then flow into the lungs down the pressure gradient. Now, let's look at expiration at rest. Expiration at rest is not an active process like inspiration at rest. Instead, it's a passive process, which means it doesn't need any major muscle contraction. So what happens during expiration at rest? 6 steps again. The diaphragm relaxes and moves up. The external intercostals relax. The thoracic cavity volume decreases. Pressure inside the lungs therefore rise above atmospheric pressure because the lung volume has also decreased, and this causes air to flow out of the lungs down the pressure gradient. All right, we've looked at inspiration and expiration at rest, but what happens during exercise? What changes? So these are the major changes. During inspiration, the major change is that everything becomes deeper and faster, and you still use your diaphragm and intercostals, but in addition, you can also recruit accessory muscles which are also involved to pull in more air when the intensity becomes high. So what happens during expiration at rest is that it becomes active. It's not a passive process anymore. It becomes active, which means it becomes forced because there are additional muscles that are being used. So during expiration, during exercise, internal intercostals and abdominal muscles contract to help to push air out harder and faster. And this matters in intense exercise because you're trying to remove CO2 much more quickly. Because during intense exercise, your muscles are contracting more, working more, so you're producing a lot more CO2, which you need to remove from the body a lot more quickly. Okay, let's look at partial pressure and diffusion. What is partial pressure? Partial pressure is simply the pressure an individual gas exerts within a mixture of gases. Air is a mixture which has multiple gases in it. Oxygen is one of those gases. Carbon dioxide is another gas. So oxygen has a certain partial pressure, and carbon dioxide has another partial pressure, which contributes to the total pressure of air. What is diffusion? Diffusion is the movement of particles from an area of high pressure to lower pressure. These two concepts tie very well into the movement of oxygen and carbon dioxide, because the reason why oxygen, say O2, moves into the blood is because the partial pressure, we're going to denote that as ppO2, the partial pressure of oxygen is higher in alveoli than in the blood that arrives at the lungs, and the blood that arrives at the lungs lacks oxygen, so we call it deoxygenated blood. And because of this, because that partial pressure is higher in the alveoli than in the deoxygenated blood, then oxygen diffuses into the blood. And conversely, we can say something similar for CO2. So the reason why CO2 moves from the deoxygenated blood into the alveoli is because the partial pressure ppCO2 is higher in the deoxygenated blood than in the alveoli, and this causes the CO2 to diffuse into the alveoli and it gets exhaled out of the body. Okay, you also need to know the lung volumes and capacities. So lung volumes are single measurements and capacities are a combination of different volumes. Tidal volume is simply the amount of air inhaled or exhaled in a normal breath. So when you go just normally every day, thousands and hundreds of times a day, that's tidal volume. Inspiratory reserve volume is the extra air you can inhale after a normal inhalation. Expiratory reserve volume, the extra air you can exhale after a normal exhalation. Residual volume is the air left in the lungs after a maximal exhalation. So a good trick with learning these is try it on yourself. So for example, with expiratory reserve volume is the extra air you exhale after a normal exhalation. So when you exhale normally, then try to forcefully exhale again after that. You find it's a bit hard, but that extra air that you exhale is your expiratory reserve volume. Residual volume, air left in the lungs after a maximal exhalation. You can try that out on yourself as well. Vital capacity, this is the maximum amount of air that you can exhale after the deepest inhale, and that is the formula for vital capacity. It's equals to tidal volume plus inspiratory reserve volume plus expiratory reserve volume. We have inspiratory capacity, which is the maximum amount of air you can inhale after a normal exhalation, and the formula for this is equals to tidal volume plus inspiratory reserve volume. Next, we have functional residual capacity, which is simply the air left in the lungs after a normal exhalation, and this is equal to expiratory reserve volume plus residual volume. Lastly, we have lung capacity, which is the total volume of air the lungs can hold after a maximum inhale. So in your exam, you might get a diagram and they might ask you to label the diagram. So you might get a diagram that looks like this. Don't panic. I'm going to show you how exactly this diagram should be labeled. So the diagram looks something like this. And they're going to ask you maybe to label certain parts of this diagram. This axis here is simply the lung volume. And they're going to ask you to label certain volumes and capacities. So what you need to know is tidal volume is this area right here. So from here to here is a tidal volume. Inspiratory reserve volume is this area here. Expiratory reserve volume, ERV, is this area here. Residual volume, RV, is this area here. Vital capacity is this area here. Inspiratory capacity. Let's see, I see it's this area here. Functional residual capacity, FRC, is this area here. And the total lung capacity, total TLC, is just the whole thing. So all the way from the top all the way to the bottom there. So those are the different volumes and capacities and how to actually label them on a graph like this. Okay, now let's look at the structure of the heart. So we have a heart diagram here. We're going to walk through each of the structures you need to know. We're going to label them and talk about their function. First, we have the atria. So atria are these chambers at the top here, the upper chambers of the heart, and their job is to receive blood into the heart. So we have the right atrium, and this is the left atrium. So when you're looking at a heart diagram or even a lung diagram, remember that it is mirrored. So if you think about your own heart and you mirror it into the screen that you're looking at right now, your right is actually your left and your left is your right, if that makes sense. So the atria are these two upper chambers that receive blood into the heart. Next, we have the ventricles. The ventricles are these lower chambers that pump blood out of the heart. So again, we have the left and the right ventricles. So left ventricle and the right ventricle. The left ventricle has a much thicker wall because it's responsible for pumping blood to the whole body. Meanwhile, the right ventricle's wall is usually less thick than the left ventricles because the right ventricle pumps blood just to the lungs. Meanwhile, the left ventricle pumps blood to the whole body. Okay, next we have something we call valves. So valves are these structures that ensure that blood doesn't flow backwards. So we have the tricuspid valve, which sits in between the right atrium and the right ventricle. So if you see these valves right here, they look like doorways. They ensure that once blood flows this way, it doesn't go back that way. So this is what we call a tricuspid valve. And then on the left side, separating the left atrium from the left ventricle, we have something called the bicuspid valve. This is also sometimes referred to as the mitral valve, but we're just going to call it bicuspid valve. We also have another set of valves that sit at the exit of the ventricles. So if you see, blood enters here and it exits here. So we have another doorway here, another doorway here, and another one here, because again blood enters here and it exits there. So these doorways that sit at the exit of both ventricles are called semilunar valves. Also, this wall that sits in the middle here is called the septum. The septum. So the septum is a wall that separates the left from the right side of the heart, and it basically is just there to stop the oxygenated blood and the deoxygenated blood from mixing. Now let's look at the sinoatrial node. The sinoatrial node is basically the heart's natural pacemaker. So the sinoatrial node initiates the electrical impulse for each heartbeat. And the sinoatrial node is found inside the right atrium, somewhere here. Somewhere here inside the right atrium. That's the sinoatrial node. Sinoatrial with the SA node. And we have the AV node, or the atrial ventricular node. So the atrial ventricular node sits somewhere around here, around the separation where the atrium, the right atrium meets the right ventricle. So somewhere around there, and that is the atrial ventricular or AV node. So the AV node receives the impulse from the atria, so that node, so from the SA node, when that node produces that impulse, it moves into the atrioventricular node, but then it delays the impulse just briefly so that the ventricles can fully fill before they contract, before it then releases that impulse which causes them to contract. So that's the AV node. And also myocardium. Myocardium is a muscular middle layer of the heart wall which contracts to create pressure and pump blood. Okay, now let's talk about the components of blood. So what blood is actually made of? So first we have plasma. Plasma is this liquid. So if you see this yellow liquid in the background that carries everything, that's plasma. And it's just the liquid portion of blood. It transports cells, nutrients, hormones, waste products, and proteins. Next, we have red blood cells. Red blood cells, RBCs. Now, red blood cells contain a protein called hemoglobin, which we've looked at in this video. And the main job of hemoglobin is to transport oxygen and also helps to transport CO2, but its main job is to transport oxygen. Next, we have white blood cells. Let me just draw them out in white. So white blood cells, let's just draw little white circles. White blood cells form our immune function. So they are part of the immune system, which is the system in the body that helps to fight disease and to fight infection. So white blood cells, WBCs. And lastly, we have platelets. So platelets are the structures which are important for clotting, and they clot to prevent excessive bleeding. So let's say I cut myself right here. Boom, I cut myself. I fell down and I scratched my knee and I cut myself. Then in that case, there are going to be a bunch of platelets that clump up over here to clot the blood, to basically stop the blood from bleeding out. So that's why platelets are really important. Okay, now let's look at the different blood vessels that we have in our body, and it's important to not only understand these but also be able to link them to their functions. So arteries carry blood away from the heart, and they have thick muscular walls to deal with high pressure. So they carry blood away from heart, and they have thick muscular walls to deal with high pressure. So you can see the thick walls here to deal with the high pressure that they have. Next, we have veins. Veins carry blood back to the heart, so towards heart. They have lower pressure and they have valves. So we saw some valves in the heart. Veins also have their own type of valves which prevent backflow. So valves to stop backflow of blood. Next we have capillaries. Capillaries are tiny blood vessels where gaseous exchange happen. So they're very important for gaseous exchange, whether it's gaseous exchange of oxygen or different types of exchange of nutrients and of waste products. They also have very thin walls. This allows for a short diffusion distance. Short diffusion distance. Okay, now let's look at some key terms when it comes to cardiovascular physiology. We're going to look at all of these terms and what they mean. So, let's start with cardiac cycle. The cardiac cycle is basically the repeating pattern of how your heart beats. So, it's the repeating pattern of two phases of a heartbeat. One, we have the diastole. The diastole basically means filling up or the relaxation of the heart, and the systole means the contraction or the ejection of the heart and of blood from the heart. So this is the cardiac cycle. First thing that happens is diastole. So ventricles relax and open up so that they can fill with blood through the open atrioventricular valves. Two, we have atrial systole. This is where the atria contract to top up the ventricles. And third, we have ventricular systole. This is where the ventricles contract, semilunar valves open so that blood can be ejected from the heart. The circulation of the heart can be split into pulmonary and systemic circulation. So pulmonary circulation is basically what happens on the right side of the heart, where the right side of the heart pumps deoxygenated blood to the lungs from the right ventricles, and that blood goes to the lungs, it picks up oxygen, it gets oxygenated, then it returns to the heart, entering through the left side of the heart, specifically entering through the left atrium. And the systemic circulation part is where the left ventricle takes that oxygenated blood and it pumps it to the whole body. That oxygenated blood delivers oxygen to the tissues and muscle tissues, and the deoxygenated blood that comes from the muscles eventually returns back to the heart through the right side of the heart, specifically entering through the right atrium. Now let's define venous return. Venous return is the process of blood returning to the heart from the body. So venous return is supported by several mechanisms, one of them being the valves in the veins, which we've spoken about. Valves in the veins are really important for just stopping backflow of blood, because imagine if your blood was trying to get to your heart, it was trying to rise up through your legs, but it just kept flowing back and flowing back and flowing back. It would never eventually reach your heart. So having those valves there stop it from flowing back. Next, we have the skeletal muscle pump, which is a mechanism where muscle contractions squeeze the veins to push out blood towards the heart. It's like when you have that little bit of toothpaste in the toothpaste container and you squeeze it to sort of push the toothpaste upwards. That's how the skeletal muscle pump works. Next, we have respiratory pump. This is where pressure changes during breathing help to move the blood back into the heart. So this is similar to the skeletal muscle pump, but this is just respiratory muscles and pressure changes in that lung and that thoracic cavity area. Vascular shunting is another key term, and this simply means the redistribution of blood to where it's needed most. So during exercise, two things happen. Blood is taken away from where it's not needed, and blood is supplied to where it's needed. So arterioles, which are basically arteries but slightly smaller arteries, arterioles that are supplying non-essential areas like the stomach or just the whole digestive system vasoconstrict, which means there's less blood supply there. Vasoconstriction just means blood vessels tightening, becoming smaller to reduce blood flow. And on the other hand, the arterioles supplying the working muscles vasodilate. Working muscles vasodilate. So vascular shunting is made up of vasoconstriction and vasodilation, where vasoconstriction happens in non-essential areas, in inactive areas, and vasodilation happens where the blood is actually needed to increase blood flow. Okay, some heart rate measures you need to know. You need to know resting heart rate. This is just your heart rate at rest. This is when you're just calm and you're not exercising, you're just sitting down, laying down. Working heart rate is your heart rate during exercise, and it depends on the intensity of exercise you're working at. Maximum heart rate is the highest heart rate that you can reach, and is often estimated by this formula. So 220 minus age, but even this formula is still an estimation, so it's not perfectly accurate. We also have heart rate reserve. Heart rate reserve is equals to your maximum heart rate minus your resting heart rate. And lastly, we have recovery heart rate. This is how quickly the heart rate falls after exercise stops. So faster recovery generally means you have a better cardiovascular fitness. So if you stop exercising and your heart rate falls really quickly compared to someone who stops exercising and it takes them ages for their heart rate to fall, then that suggests that you're fitter than the other person. Now let's look at a formula that comes under the Carnot method. So the Carnot method uses a formula to be able to measure your target heart rate for a specific training zone. And its formula is target heart rate equals to maximum heart rate minus resting heart rate times percentage intensity plus resting heart rate. So percentage intensity depends on the training zone. So usually if you're working in an aerobic training zone, you usually be working at 60 to 80% of your maximum heart rate, and then anaerobic is around 80 to 95% of your maximum heart rate. Next, we have these definitions. End diastolic volume is the volume of blood in a ventricle at the end of diastole. Remember, diastole means that process where the chamber opens up and fills up. So this is volume of blood in the ventricle at the end of filling up. And systolic volume is the volume of blood left in the ventricle after systole, so after contraction of the ventricle. Stroke volume is the blood ejected from the heart per beat, and stroke volume formula is EDV minus ESV, so end diastolic volume minus end systolic volume. Cardiac output is the blood pumped from the heart per minute, and the symbol for cardiac output is Q, which is equals to heart rate times stroke volume. All right, now let's define bradycardia. Bradycardia simply means resting heart rate that is under 60 beats per minute. And basically, if you have a heart rate that is classed as bradycardia, this means that your heart is working more efficiently at rest. Why is this? Because having a really low heart rate means that the person is a trained athlete, but also means that they have a larger stroke volume. So stroke volume is higher, and this means that they can maintain a normal cardiac output, with fewer heart beats. All right, now before we end, let's look at some acute responses to warm up and immediate activity. So when we talk about acute, we're talking about short term. So really short term, like immediately, what happens to your respiratory and cardiovascular system when you just begin exercising. So we're going to look at functional responses and structural responses. So for the respiratory system, functional responses are you experience an increase in breathing rate, increased in tidal volume, an increase in minute ventilation. Minute ventilation just means the air breathed in or out of the lungs per minute. So it's basically the minute variation of tidal volume, if that makes sense. Now for some structural responses, the bronchioles dilate to reduce resistance and increase airflow delivery. And also we have more alveoli and capillaries that are effectively used because the demand for them increases, and this creates more surface area, which is really important for gaseous exchange. Now for some cardiovascular acute responses. For the functional responses, we have an increase in heart rate, increase in stroke volume, and cardiac output also increases. Also, vascular shunting increase with more blood supply going to the working muscles. And now for the structural responses, blood vessels to working muscles vasodilate, so they widen, and also we have more capillary beds opening up in working muscles, which increases gaseous exchange. We also have something called anticipatory rise. So especially when you just begin warming up, even before you begin exercise, there's something called an anticipatory rise, which happens to your heart rate and your ventilation, which means your heart rate increases and your ventilation increases before you actually partake in any physical activity. Okay, now let's look at lifestyle. Here are some unhealthy lifestyle factors. And here are the respiratory impacts and cardiovascular impacts that these can have on a body. So respiratory impacts: damage to alveoli, which will obviously reduce gaseous exchange efficiency. Airways can become inflamed as well, which increases breathing difficulty. Oxygen uptake becomes less effective, so performance drops. And for cardiovascular impacts, there's an increase in the risk of factors like high blood pressure and cholesterol, and this puts a lot of strain on the heart and the blood vessels, which make them less efficient, makes them work too hard, and this can lead to a lot of cardiovascular diseases. So that's it for this video. If I can leave you with 3 main things to really focus on and to do a lot of repetition, a lot of practice on, is focusing on breathing mechanics during inspiration and expiration, and all of the theories, Boyle's law, pressure changes, and all of that go behind it. Focusing on gaseous exchange as well, talking about diffusion, partial pressure, all of that. And lastly, focusing on cardiac output, talking about the different volumes like end diastolic volume, stroke volume, cardiac output, oxygen delivery, performance, venous return, all of those things. These are the 3 most popular things to take away from this video, but obviously learn everything in the video. And as always, check out our website for all of the worksheets you need to really lock in on these topics and get the best grades possible. All right, I'll see you in the next video.